we suffer its own mood swings. So I'm going to kind of start while we amp up the presentation. We are, in a way, talking about an origin story this morning, how things came to be. Tilliard's thought is critical to understanding that differently. But it led me to think about our own origin story. You may not realize this, but old-fashioned Sunday school started a long time ago and has been through several different iterations. I don't even know where we were physically when it started. When I got here in 2005, we were back there, and then we were up in 382. We outgrew that room. We tried St. Mary's. We outgrew that room. We went downstairs. We outgrew that room, and we finally came up here. And frankly, with the exception of some of you, not much has been the same during those iterations, except one thing has been the same. The purpose of old-fashioned, while we learned stuff, was really about community. It was really about being together. And the person who stimulated that community, nurtured that community. How many of you have been out on Saturday night and been accosted in a restaurant to come to church the next day? I know some of you have, because that's what Mac Leaf did. He started this way back when. He has nurtured its growth. He has taken care of it like a child. We wouldn't even have all those parties if Mac didn't love to party so much. Every Sunday we kind of finish class. I call Mac, how did it go? And he always has a helpful hint for me about how to proceed. So while we are telling origin stories, I want to look back at our own origin and give thanks for Mac. So give him a round of applause. Now, what you may not know about, not yet, brother. What?
Not yet.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's been a pleasure, and I'm a very selfish person. I did it for myself. I didn't do it for you guys. I did it as a good excuse to make sure I got up and came to church every day.
There you have it. And you did. Well, what you may not realize is that Mac and Amy are moving to Beaufort, South Carolina, though they've promised to be back once a month. Yeah, I've heard that before. But we are going to miss their attendance on a regular basis. So if they're going to move geographically away from us, we're going to kind of go with them. So to take with you, we have a gift. No. This is an oil of the Cathedral from the Point, which is absolutely gorgeous, and thank you for getting us started and nurturing us along the way. We're also giving them a card with, these cards in the bookstore with the angels on them. I love that. That's what Mac has been. He's kind of been our angel from the beginning. There you are, brother. Thank you very much.
That's a big one.
I got special dispensation for the title. Yeah. Sometimes you have to live into what people call you. All right. Well, thank you very much. Where are we on our ability to move forward here? Okay. No, I don't. But one of the things I do in all seriousness that I learned from a professor that I adored, David Piccini, was to give you an image that goes with the idea. I love that. I took a history of Christian thought class, and that professor had an image for each era. And when I went to study for the exam, I only studied the images. It was interesting how that played itself out. So that's why I do it, and that's why I want to wait on it if we're ready. But given time, I may abandon my desires. Yeah. Well, So let's do a little review before we get started, because we've really gone back to the beginning. And I've suggested there are three kind of periods of time that historians use to reflect on our origins: the axial period, the pre-axial period, and the post-axial period. Now people are talking about a second axial period, but we'll get to that in a while. The pre-axial period Delio is going to be here on Saturday, April the 23rd. The pre-axial period, I've used the Starry Night as the representation because there was a consciousness and awareness of the integration of humans and nature. Each were thought to be part of the other. But when you moved into the axial period, 900 to 200 BCE, which is, by the way, when the Greek culture was at its height, you had a different kind of sense of relationship between humans and the universe. I've represented that with this kind of turning to the human with this particular image. And to borrow from our kind of hemispheric analysis of the brain last week, Ian Christensen, who wrote the book The Master and the Emissary, that I at least was borrowing from, argues that the height of Greek culture was the height of the flow of the hemispheres, of right hemisphere and left working together, which is what generated such beautiful art and music while also advancing scientific thought. But he says at the end of that period, you started to see the emergence of what we have called left brain thinking, that more analytical, mathematical, manipulate the world. Manipulate not in a pejorative sense here, just making things happen, using things. And a kind of lessening of the dependence upon or even use of the right brain. So I have depicted that through this Sinai Pantocrator, the idea that suddenly how things worked became more important than why they worked. And the beginning of the scientific kind of mindset began to predominate. As we go through that period, though, because we're in many ways still in it, the thing that I was highlighting as being important is the decentering of Earth. That is to say, they had a sense that the Earth was the middle of all of creation, and everything revolved around the Earth, and the Earth revolved around the human, and we had that sense of our being important and God being focused on us and everything being dependent, right, in some concentric circle somewhere. But along the way, we find out that actually, if we observe the heavens, it looks like the sun is the center of our universe and the earth revolves around the sun. But that set off a whole series of consequences where people began to think about God differently and about our role in creation differently. So God became more distant. God became to seem more like a prime mover, some creator that created all of this, made it wonderful, and put it out like a clock to work on its own. We were part of what had been put out, so our job was to praise God and pray and hope that God would judge us favorably when the time came. Delio argues, and I think successfully, that what happened is the cosmology, our sense of things, really got stuck in that old Hebrew sense of a three-tiered universe. While science, and particularly modern science, began to progress on with a sense of the sun being at the center and the humans being not so important. This also is a point that Christensen identifies as being part of the turn to the use of the left brain or the left mind to the exclusion of the right brain and the right mind in the development of culture and society. What happens, we have Isaac Newton there and Rene Descartes and Charles Darwin. These are all official portraits, of course, but they were the scientists that emerged in this kind of left brain, left mind oriented cultural focus. All I want to repeat were churchmen. All acted out of their faith. They were supported by the church until the little incident with Galileo. They were supported by the church. They believed they were acting out of their faith. They thought what they were discovering and revealing would be to the glory of God. That's not always the story that's told. I don't mean to excuse the church for its recalcitrance on occasion. The church is full of human beings, and it's an institution. It'll do those kinds of things. But we often think that science just ran away and the church sat there, and I think that's not true. I think the church continued to be involved in science all along the way, albeit suffering a distinction between the theology and the science that they were working with. So Newton then, in studying the law of gravity and the law of motion, comes up, he's a brilliant mathematician. All these guys were polymaths. They all mastered multiple areas and were brilliant. So Newton comes up with this idea that the universe is kind of a system, and it's a mechanical system, right? Each part is a separate entity, and it works on cause and effect. One part does what it does, causing another part to move. And time and space are kind of fixed things. They're fixed things while the works a lot. So what you get is a Newtonian system that's really captivating the imaginary of all areas of study, if not regular life. It's a closed system. It tends to have a top-down orientation. It's focused on order, right? It is dependent upon hierarchy to maintain that order and the control that a hierarchy naturally exerts. Some of these terms have pejorative meanings, but I don't intend that. I only mean to say, in a universe where everything has its way, it makes sense, you'd have a controlling authority, goals that you're trying to reach, and you're laying out ways that you go about doing that, as if science works kind of like a game of pool, where one ball hits another and causes it to go where you want it to go. And those of you who are involved in leadership systems and training will recognize this model, right? At least when I came along, that's the way you did a strategic plan, right? You got your committee together and you articulated your goals and the way you were going to get to your goals, and it all seemed right. And if you had your plan, you thought you were good to go. Later in my own career, I wound up in the early 80s working for technology companies, which was a fascinating experience. So at one point, I was working with UPS and some startup technology companies. UPS, who back then was primarily focused on organizing really low-skilled labor in many ways and making the same thing happen again and again and again with great reliability, which they were great at doing. And to be in their corporate headquarters was fascinating. If you went to the lunchroom, you couldn't take your food off the tray. You had to wear a coat and tie. And at the end of the day, your desk in your office had to be clean, no papers on your desk. And the door had to be open. I mean, it was like being in this very regimented culture. And at the same time, I'd go over to one of the startup technology companies, and those guys had they had stuff in their offices that hadn't been cleaned up in a year. There was some basketball net over the trash can. Guys are wearing blue jeans, and the pizza box is still there from the last staff meeting. And that contrast led me to wonder, why? Why? And what I concluded is because each developed a system that was oriented towards their purpose, right? UPS was about getting error out of the system. And every time we'd start a deal, the first meeting would be about everybody sitting around a table kind of telling their story. And all the UPS guys had the same story, basically. When I was 16 years old, I went down to the distribution hub and I started working the midnight shift. And I've worked my way up from there, gone to several different cities, and now I'm in the corporate headquarters doing deals. I've been here for 23 years. And they would all tell those stories, and you're just like, wow, And you go over to the high-tech company, and they go, well, I dropped out of Harvard yesterday. I mean, I was there for a couple of weeks, but I think this is going to be fun. But in the technology environment, it was about creativity, and it was about opportunity. It wasn't about top-down management. It had to be organic. Chaos, and we later came to kind of enshrine chaos as a good thing, but it became part of the culture because you were doing different things. The Newtonian system then, coming out of the 17th century, really dominates the way people are thinking about things, and it affects how they're thinking about God. And then along comes Einstein. So Einstein, of course, the brilliant again, polymath, but mathematician in this case, physicist. And he comes along with this formula, E equals mc squared. And what he says is, neither time nor space is fixed. They both change. They both change. He's studying light and watching how light bends. And he says, mass and energy are related. In the Newtonian system, they're separate things. Newton thinks they're particles and they're waves of energy and they're different things. And Einstein comes along and says, no, they're not. They kind of impact each other, right? So a particle and a wave start to have this relationship in Einstein's imagination. There's a wonderful story about his discovering the theory of relativity. His wife says he came down to breakfast one morning in his lab coat, or I don't know why he's wearing a lab coat, but that's what she says, to get his breakfast and his coffee, and he sits there and he says, I have a wonderful thought. And she said, great, what is it? And he says, well, it's going to take a little while to work out. She said, okay, well, what is it? And he goes, I'll tell you later. And he drinks his coffee and he goes to the piano and he comes back to his coffee and he goes back to the piano and he does that for a while and then he goes up to his study and he doesn't come out for 3 weeks. She takes food up and puts it outside his door. And at the end of 3 weeks, it comes out with 2 pages on which he has put the theory of relativity, which would change all of science and the way we think about the world. My wife said, I don't mind when you get up early to write a sermon, but none of this 2-week stuff. You're not getting any food from me. Anyway, so what Einstein says, this theory of relativity, relating particles and waves, he says time and space aren't fixed. It's not just there for us to play with. It's actually all part of this dynamic whole. Time doesn't flow at a fixed rate, and each of time and space is related to each other. Now, there are books about how this works, and I won't begin to try to describe it for fear that one of you as a physicist will correct me. But it does yield a new way of looking at the world. This is the point. So in the Einsteinian system, or post-Einstein, what you have is you move from a closed system to an open system, right? Where there's energy in the system, and it's taking energy from the outside, and things are changing. This is the way the technology companies were. We didn't have goals we were looking for. We had opportunities. We didn't even plan more than 90 days out because we didn't think the world was going to be the same. So it was useless. We didn't have strategic plans. We just didn't even do it. You move from a top down to a kind of bottom up order, right? Things are organic, they're related, so you watch them percolate. We went from maintaining order to a notion of greater complexity. You're moving from simple to greater. From hierarchy to something called holarchy, which is each part is its own whole, and it's the relationship between the wholes which generates the more complex body. You don't need to know that if it doesn't resonate with you. From control to participation, from goals to possibilities, individual to interconnected, mechanistic to holistic. What I want you to see from that list of things is simply that things are dynamic. We used to think they were fixed, and now they change. And it's right at the core of life. And that affects everything, right? So first, we're not the center of the universe, and then it looks like we are just kind of operating on our own, and now Einstein's saying, no, it's all interrelated. It's all organic. It's all changing all the time. So we have this question. If matter and energy are really different forms of the same thing, what's the thing they're forms of? What's behind it all? What's motivating it, driving it, feeding it, fueling it? And this is where Tilliard comes in, I think. But before we get to Tilliard, I want to continue to kind of hold up the church's role in all this. We go back and we do look at our origins. And if everything is expanding all the time, what about the universe, right? And people theorized first that the universe was in fact expanding. And then Hubble looks through his telescope and he says, gosh, it does appear as if things that are out there are moving away from us. And in fact, the things that are farther out are moving away faster than the things that are close. So not only is it dynamic, it's all moving. In fact, it looks a lot like particles in an explosion, right? If something just exploded, this would be what the pattern of behavior you might witness. So George Lemaitre in 1927, a Belgian Roman Catholic priest, proposed what he called the hypothesis of the primeval atom. I think he misspelled atom. He later called it the beginning of the world. So clearly the Genesis creation stories are in his mind and awareness. But now we think of it as something else. Now we think of his theory as the Big Bang, right? The idea that there was this kind of hot origin that exploded with all these possibilities for life that then cooled off just enough to let those things happen. But what Tilliard argues is that the thing behind it all is consciousness. He'll later describe that as love. But I think it's helpful, given our kind of conceptions of love, to realize that he started at consciousness. Literally, what are we aware of? Because what we see, what we're aware of, impacts who we are, how we behave, what we do, what we think is right and wrong. Right? So Tilliard comes along. Remember, Tilliard is a paleontologist. He is a scientist. He's a Jesuit, but he's not a theological scholar. He's a scientist. So he's familiar with all of this stuff, and what he's saying is, yes, this is all happening. You'll recognize the Rodin statue of the thinker there at the edge. He's putting humanity right back in the mix. We're not in the middle of it anymore. We've gone to a heliocentric universe. We're on the cutting edge of it, Tilliard posits. Because we are unique in creation, at least to the extent we know it. But before we get to what's unique, you do automatically have this kind of conflict coming out of Darwin's sense of evolution, right? And that is, what is it? Is it Adam and Eve? We're fully formed and put here by God, or is it evolution? And are those different? And of course, our theology would say, no, they're not different. But for a long time, this illustrates what I've been arguing, I think, about having a science mind and a theological mind, and just letting them coexist but not affect each other. As if we could answer questions of meaning, why, and questions of mechanics, how, without the answers of one impacting the other. When I was in the 5th grade, we were in a small town in South Carolina, and my dad was the Episcopal priest in town, maybe 25,000 people, it's a mill town. And a guy named Bobby Richardson was my best friend. Anybody know who Bobby Richardson was? He was second baseman of the Yankees, hit a home run in the World Series. Anyway, it's kind of cool when you go to spend the night with your buddy and there are 5 golden gloves up in his bookcases, right? So, but we were best friends, and we were kind of the 2 smart kids in the class. He was the good smart kid, and I was the bad smart kid, but we were the smart kids, right? That was kind of my identity. That's how we moved around all the time. That was my gig. And so we came up to evolution in this little town in South Carolina, and we were going to have a debate. So Robbie and I got together, and he was adamant. He was a very evangelical Christian. He was adamant that we were going to argue against evolution. I was like, I don't care as long as we win. So we went out and found all this stuff, and of course we won, and I thought, oh, that's fine. I didn't care. And I got home, and my dad said, did you guys have a debate about evolution? I said, yeah. He said, well, what side did you take? I said, oh, I was against it. He said, why? I said, because Bobby wanted to do it that way. I don't think Dad got over that for the rest of his life. We immediately had to go to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. I got wonderful science education. But, to me, it was like, whatever, just a different part of my brain, right? Whatever position didn't affect what I thought about God. And if you go to Kentucky, you can see the ark fully formed, and Adam and Eve are probably there. But we have this theory of evolution articulated by Darwin, and what do we do with that? Well, Tilliard comes along and he says, I think what's behind this Big Bang model is consciousness. And what evolution really is the expansion of consciousness, the expansion of what we're aware of. And what's unique about people is that they are not only part of it, they rise from the process, he says, but they can also stand apart and reflect on it. So here's the key. Do you see why that's important? You're part of it. We are here because we're the result of this process was it yielded us in our current form and function, and yet we can stand apart because we are self-conscious and we can reflect on it. Now, you will remember when we were doing the story of Adam and Eve, I was arguing that that's really what the fruit is. The fruit is really the knowledge of differences, which is self-consciousness. That's one interpretation of it, which explains why we had to leave the garden before eating from the tree of life, because you had to integrate that into your sense of the whole before you thought you'd take it all over and do it. You can see, I hope, left brain and right brain thinking in that. But the reason that's important is because if that's the model that you assume, and I think Teilhard would, then you're not going back to the garden, right? That's the old model of cosmology. You're not going back to the garden, you're moving forward to integrate that self-consciousness with your deeper mind in order to be something new and different. So Teilhard says, primacy of consciousness. But he's not alone. Look at what Einstein says. Einstein says a human being is part of the whole, called by us universe. One experiences oneself as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of one's consciousness. Our task must be to free ourselves from this person by widening out our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Now, if you sat with those words, I think you would feel a lot of the spiritual discussions we've been having. Why do we feel we're separate from God when we never are? You know, when we do the blessing at the end of the liturgy and we say, may the blessing of God be with you and remain with you. Our fundamental theological conviction is that God is always there and never gone. God is always with you. The only question is whether you know it or not. And most of us go through times in our life where we feel abandoned by God. Right? As much as I kind of don't normally like these things, I do like that poster where the footsteps on the beach. You guys seen that poster? I'm always inclined to dismiss stuff like that when it shows up, but I think this is a powerful point. And the voice says, like, where were you during this period where I had, they're just one set of footsteps. There are two steps and then just two sets and then just one. So reading the tracks, the question is, where were you? And the answer is, those are my footsteps. I was carrying you. You didn't think I was present, but I was present. And it's not important to me that you know I was present or not. I just carried you through your time of suffering, through your time of strife, through your time of not knowing who or where you were. That's our fundamental faith. So you see Einstein saying the same thing. From his extremely complicated and sophisticated scientific perspective, what he's saying is it's all related. We're never separated from God. We just suffer this optical delusion periodically. And the mystics and all of the traditions of all the major religions in the world have focused exactly on this for a long time. Right? That's what idolatry is all about. Right? Having our ultimate concern, as Tillich would say, be something other than God. Thinking that whatever it is, even if it's a good thing, is going to give us the life that it promises, which it doesn't. But then, Einstein says, our task is to free ourselves from that. You can see in that, I hope, the same kind of letting go that we talked about, for example, in centering prayer. Or when we talked about detachment from those things that promise to give us our identity but don't. How do we let go of our anxiety over what people say about us, or what we own or possess, or what we've achieved? Which is all a natural part of life, and yet if we look to those three sources of identity, we will be frustrated in the end. How do you detach from that? How do you free yourself from that? The ultimate promise of God is freedom, liberation, right? What is the devil saying to Jesus in the wilderness immediately after the baptism? Don't get all caught up on being God's beloved. Come over here and let's talk about what people are saying about you, what you own and possess, i.e. power, and what you can achieve, feeding all the people. Ironically, those questions, I think, map directly onto the temptations that Satan is offering to Jesus. All of that right out of Scripture, but here is Einstein saying, widen our circle of compassion, love, How do you love more? Expand your conscious awareness. Expand what you're aware of, which doesn't just mean noticing more things. It means noticing things more deeply, right? Which might be the good in your enemy, the sameness in the other, things that our fears make it hard for us to see. How do we use our spiritual maturation, our development of our relationship with God in order to put those fears at bay and see the goodness in God's creation so that we can react to it, nurture it, help it grow? Be liberated from the fear of our own survival, our own death. All of these themes, which we've addressed in this class for years, which you can see in all the mystical traditions, are really right here in Einstein's comment, I think. Right there. But they are not alone. This guy, Max Planck, some of you know him, he's looking at the same thing, and he says, all matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particle of an atom to vibration and holds the most minute solar system of the atom together. If you didn't take physics, it doesn't matter. It's just somebody else saying the same thing. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is a matrix of all matter. These are scientists looking into the world they see in their experiments and saying, gosh, there seems to be some intellect here that provides a cohesive whole. Something that's holding it together. Not Newtonian's mechanics, but something else which is holding it together. Some consciousness. James Jeans says, the universe looks more like a great thought than a great machine. Mind no longer appears as an accident intruder into the realm of matter. Mind may be the creator and governor of the realm of matter. The quantum phenomena make it possible to propose that the background of the universe is mind-like. You may not understand the science he's referring to. That's not important. What is important is these people are looking into the large things, are seeing the presence of God. And those people who are looking into the small things, the quantum elements of science, are seeing an intelligence that you and I would ascribe to the Creator, the God. Some of the best theology I've seen lately has come out of people, scientists who think they're atheists. It's almost comic, in a sense. Because what they start describing looks a lot like the God that we are used to worshiping. The God that is not only present, but provides the network, the matrix, the fabric for all creation to be present. That's been our faith all along. You're not going to be able to see this. I put it in the slides because if you go to the website and get the slides, I want you to be able to have it. So this is a chart which Maggie Ross has developed. Maggie Ross is an Anglican solitary, which means she's a nun, basically, in England. And she has developed a kind of topology or a framework for thinking about the mind that looks almost exactly like what Ian Christensen came up with through his scientific explorations. He talks about the brain, she talks about the mind. Whether they're different things or not is a cocktail party conversation that takes longer than I've got now, but let's assume they're the same for the moment. And so she has on the left side of the page kind of identified things that are similar to what we talked about last week, and on the right side of the page identified things that are similar, but expressed in religious terms. What I want to point out to you is in the middle of the page. If you can actually control those left minds, self-conscious mind is what she calls it, you can control those functions more because you're using them to manipulate the world, but you can't control the functions that she associates with the right mind or the deeper mind. You can only influence them. They are the ones that see the whole, that really express themselves in context of relationships. So what does she think allows you to influence them? Contemplative prayer, silence, stopping the noise, right? Stopping the noise so that the left brain is deprived of its power. This is a discussion we were having with Reg last week when Reg was reminding us, based on some presentations he's made, I'll put a link to some of your stuff on the slides just to embarrass you. But the point is that music is a way that gets by that controlling part of your left mind. So is silence. Whether you're experiencing that silence in a walk in the woods or on the golf course or just unexpectedly. And we have so little opportunities for that. Some of you know there was a basketball game last night. I tried desperately to avoid it. I was going to a friend's house for dinner. They said, "Don't worry, we'll put it on." I said, "Please don't." But they did anyway, causing me to question their friendship. They're actually in this room, but I won't talk to them directly. Anyway, the point is that Duke just pounded North Carolina. Better team, better coach, no hope. So naturally, when we begin to reflect on the game, we don't want to think about what actually happened. We go back to 1982 when we beat them, right? So this is actually Coach Krzyzewski, the Duke coach, one of the best coaches ever in basketball. This is his last game in Chapel Hill. So this morning I was reading an article about the first game he experienced there where he got crushed just as badly as he won last night, because we'll do anything to resurrect our dignity. But here's the interesting thing. At that first game, in the middle of the game, the lights went out in the arena. Like power got cut. There was nothing. There was darkness for an hour and a half. Did anybody leave that game? No. You know what they didn't have? Cell phones. Can you even imagine being in a dark arena for an hour and a half with no cell phone to look at? But to me, that's just an example of how we've lost solitude, how much noise there is in our lives, how much looking at our phone gives us whatever it is, a dopamine hit or whatever it is it does. You know, at one point, I've told you this before, but I'll repeat it now. I decided I was just on my phone too much, and I was, just looking at it all the time. And so I developed this practice of not taking it into meetings. I'm not going to have it. Another thing I learned at the tech company, we used to have a box at the door. You throw the phones in the box. I'm sitting in this meeting, and it starts to vibrate in my pocket. And I'm thinking, I forgot to take my phone out. But I'm a disciplined guy. I spent half my life in prayer. I can do this. I'm not going to look at the phone. Then it vibrates again. And I'm like, well, what if it's one of the kids? Like, what if something's wrong? Or what if Carolina got a new recruit? Any of those things that are really important. And so I wait until the focus of the room tends to go over there, and I reach my phone. I'm just going to look at it, I don't even have my phone. It's like a phantom vibration. I'm like, I've never been so convicted. I mean, it's just like, it just became so much. But it's like, apparently, like if you lose a leg, you still feel your toes. Well, right? It just worked into my life. It's worked into my life. So I think where, you go back to the early church and being out and looking up at the night sky, like everybody knew the stars. It was a natural description. Think about Dante and his great work. Each part kind of ends with a reference to stars. And when they emerge from hell, what they say is, we're going to come out, we're going to behold the stars again, as if that's a sign of God's presence. But now, it's hard to even see the night sky if you don't go to some place where the light pollution is down. It's just not part of our worldview, our cognitive framework. We just don't orient ourselves around it. And I think the same is true of silence, right? There are these things that were just always part of life and spirituality that now we have to work to get. But it's worth doing. Because what Maggie Ross is saying is that's how you access the deeper mind. The mind that gives you a sense of God's presence, the mind that actually understands when the Holy Spirit is moving, the mind that can guide you in ways that aren't subject to your control, the mind that needs to be involved in all decisions. So that what Maggie Ross is claiming and what Ian Christensen is arguing for are the same thing, and that is the self-conscious mind, left brain, emerged as its dominant force began to emerge at the end of the Greek civilization. We're all the way back before Jesus, has continued through the Newtonian system as being this driving, controlling framework for how we looked at the world. And it pushed the awareness of God's presence farther and farther out. That the way we regain all of that is through a transfiguration of perspective, through a change in how we see things, right? And when we change how we see things, we reestablish, they both claim, the flow between the right and the left brain, the flow between the deeper mind and the self-conscious mind. The point is not to get rid of one or the other. The point is to fully utilize both of them, right? Both of them. And that's when we're at our most creative. And that's when we're at our most compassionate. And that's when we are at our most empathetic posture. Right? And that's what prayer does, I think. And it's part of what our liturgy is designed to do. Right? So we're looking at our salvation not in terms of the judgment favorably rendered by some distant maker of the universe, but instead by becoming more alive, more full. And in doing so, we will be more rooted in God's presence and God's agent in the world. And that is how Tilliard believes we are at the edge of evolution. And what drives us to do that, what drives us to expand that consciousness, Tilliard says love. Love is what attracts us to others. Love is what binds us with others. Love is what allows us in that union to transcend what we were before, where you're not just two, you're one. It's a great wedding homily, which was last Saturday night's wedding, right? It's a great wedding homily because we look at the institutional marriage and its sacredness kind of for that purpose, right? Love is the most universal, the most tremendous, and the most mysterious of all cosmic forces. But what Tilliard is doing is identifying love as this fundamental motivating desire, which is also an energy present in the universe and driving the very formation of the universe. As it continues to expand, simple moves to complex, because particles and waves are attracted to each other and form a greater whole. Right? Its presence is what he's arguing allows us to move from matter to spirit. Right? And then there's a philosophy of love, which you can check out if you want to go to the slides on the website. I'm going to skip over it here. But ultimately, he leaves us with this question: who will give evolution its own guide? I happen to believe that one of the interesting things about what we're talking about is it is the future of the church. It is the future of the church. Our learning how to be in the presence of God, to have a life that is in God, and have that God be all around us and understand its characteristics by virtue of its ability to cause us to grow, to expand our compassion and empathy, etc. I think that's the key to the church. I mean, when I talk to my kids about whether they're going to church or not, they're like, yeah, I am, really. It's important, I know. If I talk to them about meditation, like, yeah, what about that? Or I talk to them about how to live in a world that's changing this rapidly, how to orient yourself towards a life of change so that you're not constantly looking back to something that used to be, because you're never going to get that again anyway. That's what they're wrestling with. They get that part. Are we relevant to them as they try to live? And I believe that God is relevant to them as they try to live, and we can explain it using our own language. Because that's what we've been talking about all along. But we need to have both minds operating. We need to have both hemispheres cooperating with each other. We need to expand our understanding of God's presence. And when we do, following Tilliard's guidance, I think, we'll find that set of footprints on the beach was, in fact, those of our God. That we were not abandoned, we were not alone, we were not separate from God, we were being carried. Amen. I have been fussed at by the children's ministries people because I kept you too long last week. I'm not in a position where I can tolerate being fussed at by the children's community people. So if you have children that need to be picked up, go with my blessing and get your children and save my marriage. If you have questions, however, I'm happy to entertain them for a minute or two, and then I've got to get to church myself.
Hi, George. Bill and I were talking about this class during the week, last week, went home and talked about it and blah, blah. I started looking into one of Miss DeLilio, is that her name?
Delio.
Yeah, one of her books, and thinking about the cosmos with our form of worship and incorporating the two. Not that I understand it, but it kind of turned a light on. But I'll tell you what has really stumped me, and I know that the Scopes Trial book was on one of your recommended readings in the bookstore, and I just am really having a lot of trouble understanding how are the two possible at the same time? Or do you have to be over here with evolution and then abandon what we, believe here in church? Because if you open your mind, how can you not be open to evolution? And what do you do with that?
I think the simple answer is no. I think the harder you drive into the how, you're going to have questions of why. And the harder you drive into why, you're going to have questions of how. And religion and science separated from each other leave each impoverished. Religion needs science to find out what's true and what's not. The Dalai Lama said, when science is inconsistent with Buddhism, Buddhism has to change. I think we'd be well served to adopt a similar attitude. Not because we're not afraid of what science is going to discover, because we believe that God is there. And so if science says, no, not there, we're better off. So we don't have to be afraid of science overrunning religion. God is present. It's only going to be revealed in greater force by science presence. Similarly, science needs religion. It's not, in my view, mere happenstance that all these scientists, like George, who came up with the Big Bang, are religious people. In the old days, the church was giving them the leisure to be scientists. But now, where do you think that idea came from? He didn't look at data and said, oh, Big Bang. He's got Genesis in his mind. And the presence of God as the creator in his mind. So, no, I think, and what Teilhard is arguing is that evolution is a theological project. It is God working out God's way in the world. And so, no, you don't have to choose one or the other. That's what we thought 30 years ago. That's what Teilhard's arguing against. They not only go together, they're not inconsistent with each other, but they depend upon each other. And our task is to learn how to do that. And we'll be rewarded by a richer life, I think. That's an excellent question, though.
Who allows us to know more and more and more as we're able. And that's the way I see putting it together.
I like that. Yeah, exactly. If you're doing meditations and you have an experience of a presence, somebody can explain that as a psychological phenomenon, something that your brain has generated by virtue of chemicals, and maybe so, I don't know. But the deeper and deeper you go, the less and less that explanation seems to hold water, and then you get to the point where you just don't care, right? So similarly, I think what science is finding, the deeper and deeper we go into quantum mechanics, the more and more there is to learn, and that's cool. That's fun. And it can be engaged with the confidence that that's God at work. So I think you're absolutely right.
George,
Yeah.
did Einstein believe in a God as the supreme force?
You know, Einstein's views on God have been critiqued by a number of people. I'm hesitant to answer that for fear of getting it wrong, but he certainly defined a God he did believe in. Does anybody remember that? There's a great quote from Einstein in which he says, I believe in this. And I'll look it up for you and get it to you. Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, you know, I think Einstein's trying to navigate all the Institute churches and their doctrines, but, I mean, you could see he believes there's a divine presence driving all this. Yeah. Lucy.
In 1929, Albert Einstein said something that really excited me. He said, imagination is greater than fact.
Yeah, that's good. If you have more questions, you can contact me. I'm going to put the slides up on the site. They've got some things that you might enjoy, which include this poem. Well, I just lost it, but there's a poem at the end by Christian Wyman, who I love, called Every Riven Thing, which I think captures exactly what Tillyard's talking about. This is a contemporaneous poet. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.